like COVID all over again. Hi everyone, my name's Tamara Gingic. I am from Fashion Roundtable, and I'm literally at the table today in my kitchen. But I'm really delighted to be here with Meg Peary from my team and Zakia Sewell.
Sewell, yeah.
I got it right. Great. As someone with a name that is not pronounced in English as it's spelt, I always try to be very conscious about other people's names because it puts people at ease. I think it's very important to be respectful. Zakia is like me in that she's from the kind of boundary suburbs of London. You're from Hounslow, aren't you, originally?
Yeah.
And her brilliant book, it's a bit wobbly, the table, but it's called Finding Albion for anyone that then watches this back on video. I've read it with great interest, and so has Meg. How would we describe you? A writer, folk researcher, DJ, a broadcaster, which is the definition of polymath. You host Dreamtime on Radio 6 for the BBC, and you've been producing and presenting radio documentaries and podcasts for the BBC. So there's a 4-part series on BBC Radio 4, My Albion, and that was the inspiration for the book. What I love about the book is it delves into ideas about folklore and myth across the Isles and also across the seasons, which we'll draw out in the conversation. But what I was really interested in when I think we were in the heart of the book in a way, and is that sense of a reflection, because you're from a dual heritage, of the links between your Caribbean mother's heritage and their roots of some of the myths and the folklore and the carnivals that happen there, which are a kind of distillation of what the colonial force, or how would you call it, the structures put in those in the former colonies, and then that's reflected back in Notting Hill. So it's almost like 3 layers of storytelling. As someone from a mixed heritage myself, I'm half Turkish and half British. I always have that sense, and it was particularly pertinent for me with the election last week. I felt very much again how I felt as a child, that sense of they don't want me here, but where do I go? And what I think was very powerful in your book was the sense of, but we were always here. We're only here because you were there, by the way, which obviously is a famous saying by, I knew his daughter, Natasha, and I can't remember his name now, but, a famous philosopher has said that. And that actually also reading in your book that a part of Tudor London was 5% black, so which predates slavery, and therefore it's an empowering story to understand that diversity has always been part of the conversation. And I just wonder if we could just delve into that heart of the book, because I felt for me that was the heart of the book. What your learnings were from that, because I think that would be great for our listeners.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, this book is very much written sort of from the perspective, from this kind of place of in-betweenness, my dual heritage, my whiteness, my blackness, my dad's English and Welshness, my mother's Caribbeanness. And as perhaps this can be sometimes a kind of conflict-ridden place to be. And I totally resonate with what you were saying about that idea of, when we're made to feel like we don't belong here, then where could we belong? Because for me, going back to the Caribbean, I'm 100% British in their eyes. Even though I've still got family on the island, as soon as I open my mouth, I don't even need to open my mouth. They can see by the way that I'm dressed and that I look that I'm not, a Caribbean in the sense that they are. So there are these complexities that come with this position. But I think it's also a really rich place to be, and I think I've tried to sort of utilize this in-betweenness in the book as a space where we can hold multiple truths, that we can sort of see almost two perspectives at once. And it's absolutely been the kind of driver, or was the driver for me to seek out those traditions that complicated that vision of Britain, or even that vision of Britain's folk culture as, this thing that is white, that only happens in rural English villages. Um, so in the chapter that you're talking about is the chapter that's about the Notting Hill Carnival, which many people might not see as a British folk tradition, or ever even think to include it when we're thinking about the seasonal customs that happen in this country. But even though I've been going to the Notting Hill Carnival since I was a kid, there's this whole long and convoluted and complex sort of story of exchange and fusion kind of woven into the carnival that I wasn't aware of. So the Notting Hill Carnival is based on Trinidadian carnivals. Basically, the Notting Hill Carnival and most Caribbean carnivals are kind of based on the kind of the foundational Trinidadian carnivals that happened during the slavery era. And what I learned through researching the book was that those initial Trinidadian carnivals were actually the expressions, the kind of festivities of the white planter class.
Wow.
And the enslaved people were forbidden from partaking. In fact, there are various kind of references to the horrific punishments that they'd be subjected to if they dared to partake. And in fact, those kind of early colonialists, and it was a mixture of the kind of French and Spanish planters who were there, who'd colonized the island before the British, and then later the British colonizers who brought with them their May Day traditions, and mixed them up with the Roman Catholic traditions of the French and Spanish. This was a carnival in which the white planters would dress up and use blackface and mimic their black slaves. This was a way of kind of consolidating, or sort of expressing the strict hierarchies of the Trinidadian slave society. And it wasn't until after emancipation that then the formerly enslaved reclaimed the carnival, and they infused their West African traditions, and they used it as an opportunity to take the piss out of their former masters by dressing in kind of fancy frocks and kind of parading these various kind of characters through the streets. Much to the horror of the planter class. And then when the Notting Hill Carnival, so when that carnival then travelled to Britain, you had the story of Claudia Jones, who was an incredible Trinidadian activist who put on the first Caribbean carnival in Britain, but it was indoors. It was, in King's Cross in the town hall. It was sort of filmed by the BBC. It wasn't this kind of, the bacchanalian carnival that we know of today. It was actually a woman called Ronnie Laslett, who was an East End social worker, who put on the first Notting Hill parade. And that parade was styled as an Old English fair, as a revival of an ancient tradition. And it did have the Trinidadian steel pan and, other Caribbean aspects, but it also had Irish girl pipers.
I mean, there was always a massive Irish community on that part of London. And
absolutely,
before the kind of gentrification of the noughties, that was a very working class area for generations. So I think that's also the fusion of it. And I think what I found hopeful in your book was that sense of the reinterpretations that give a positivity to what are the challenges. As you cite in the book, you can guarantee that there will be newspapers that will talk about riots or disturbances at Notting Hill, and yet it's far tamer than when I went, when I was a lot younger, because you're now shut down at quite an early time.
Yeah.
And you can get home, because I remember, you couldn't really get home. You'd be walking for miles, and but and is that do you think, because also you're from London, do you think that gives you a sense of connection also to the urbanness and folklore?
Yeah, well, that's it. I think, it's interesting what you're saying about the carnival, this kind of the news headlines around the carnival, because, reading some of these newspaper reports from, Trinidad in the 1800s, they're using exactly the same language. They're calling the carnival a kind of an abomination and a kind of wild excess, and it's a den of sin and all of this kind of stuff. the same language is being used then to describe the carnival, and it's because the carnival is this incredible show of force. It's about it's there is a rebellious spirit in the carnival to take up the streets and to sort of, in the face of oppression, whether that's in Trinidad during the post-slavery era, or it's in 1970s in London. um in Britain, there is something rebellious and dangerous to the kind of the system and the state when we come together and on the streets in a united fashion. So absolutely, and you're talking about that idea of countering the idea of folk culture. Obviously, a lot of folk traditions in this country do happen in rural areas. They're traditionally the expressions of rural communities who are kind of marking the agricultural calendar. That's why you have, harvest festivals and, it's the spring equinox. It's these kind of pivotal seasonal shifts in the year where we find a lot of these traditions. May Day being a big one, for example, that we've just had. But there has always been an urban aspect, an urban seam of British folk culture. Um, One of the kind of most recognisable folk characters, it's called the Jack in the Green, which they have a big Jack in the Green festival in Hastings every year at May Day, and it's basically kind of someone dressed as a tree with ribbons and kind of like wobbles around with usually some Morris dancers getting involved. Although this is something that you probably now see in lots of rural places around the country, the tradition actually originated with London chimney sweeps in the 1700s, and milkmaids who would go through the streets, very, very working class, and they would do it to basically earn a bit of extra cash. So I was really interested in, yes, looking at some of those more stereotypical, kind of better known examples of British folk culture and looking at what they can teach us about our past and our present and who we are in Britain, but also seeking out those stories that kind of counter or trouble those green and pleasant sort of stereotypes or traditional images of folk. Because actually, I think a lot of people feel that like folk has nothing to do, like they have a particular image of folk culture and think, oh, that's not to do with me. But then when you situate folk in an urban context and say this has been a London thing since the 1700s, or you say this is a Caribbean thing, or drawing out those alternative visions, I hope that it makes people become more curious and interested in this aspect of culture.
There's one other thing before I know Meg's going to ask some questions that I really wanted to tease out of you as well. Is early on in the book you talk about a sense of Albion, which is the name you're finding Albion. You're questing for this pre-name for the country, the United Kingdom, Britain that we live in. And you say it was a place of rest. You cite a story that it's actually a place of refuge, which I think is really interesting given the narrative coming from parts of the popular press and increasingly worryingly mainstream politics. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit for us, Zakia.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, Albion's the ancient name for Britain. We don't really know exactly where it came from, but it's a name that's sort of shrouded in mystery, and it's sort of this metaphorical space where people have projected their kind of hopes and dreams and fantasies about our past, our present, and our future. So it kind of serves as a kind of alternative Britain and almost a kind of shadow Britain or something that we can sort of seek out. So there are some kind of associated myths and legends around this word Albion. The most dominant myth is one connected to a 12th century historian called Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote something called the History of Kings of Britain, the History of the Kings of Britain, which was supposedly one of the first histories of the country, although a lot of it was made up. But he wrote about Albion, so being this land of giants. Who basically ruled over Albion until the arrival of Brutus, who was a Trojan war hero who turned up and he slayed Gog and Magog, who were the kind of two lead giants of the time, and he colonized the land and he renamed it Britain. But then other scholars and poets wanted to fill in the gaps, and they created a kind of backstory about how did those giants get there. And then you get this really fascinating story about Albina, and her 30 sisters, and they were supposedly the daughters of a Syrian king. In some stories they're Greek, but they're not from this land, and they're known for being extraordinarily beautiful but very disobedient, and they plot to murder their spouses in the night.
Mhm.
Um, and they're found out and they're exiled from Syria, and they sail, the seven seas in small boats, and they arrive and they land on this beautiful uninhabited island, which Albina names after herself. She calls it Albion. And it's quite interesting because there's obviously a kind of misogynistic aspect to this tale. But it's almost like they're living in a kind of feminist utopia, and there's a lot of detail about how they're learning to kind of commune with the land and hunt its wild animals and things like that. And then they procreate with demons, basically, and they give breast to the giants. But and like I said, there are darker elements to this. I suppose there are darker elements to this story, in that then you get Trojan, who represents the kind of Western civilizer who comes and kind of wipes out the barbarians. So that's one sort of way of reading the story. But I think that there's another very interesting way to think about this myth, which is that we've got people arriving in small boats in Britain to start a new life, and that being part of the foundational origin story of this country. And you could imagine an alternative origin myth where the people of Britain literally came from the earth. They were molded from the clay of the land. But there's no idea of indigeneity. You've got Albina and her sisters, and then you've got Brutus coming in. And so I think that we could repurpose this myth, as an origin story, and perhaps we'd think differently about people arriving in small boats to this land today if more people knew about these early myths.
And it's such a shame.
That's very powerful.
Yeah, and I think it's such a shame that we don't use that story and tell that story more, because that would be far more, welcoming as well for people. If that's our story and we tell it and it's a folk story. And I think what I found interesting about lots of the things that you said in your book was that we have all of this and we don't tell any of it. So that's why I think that, when I started reading, I was like fascinated, because, a lot of it was, new to me as well. And I'm very interested in sort of folk. But you kind of also talk about in your book the Operation Raise the Colour movement. And you write, the whole affair exposed the often murky relationship we have with our national symbols in Britain. And I think this was really quite poignant in your book, and that I was surprised that a lot of our national symbols are actually sort of, for want for a better word, sort of imports. Can you sort of delve into that a little bit more for us?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, starting with the St. George's flag, it's an interesting example. The St. George's flag, which we have seen, emblazoned, or waved down the streets in recent times in kind of nationalist protests, or painted on roundabouts or whatever. It actually, well, not only has it got a connection to St. George, the patron saint, St. George himself was, supposedly Turkish. There you go, tomorrow. And and his mum was supposedly born in what would today be Palestine. He'd never set foot in England, and yet he's this kind of symbol of Englishness that we share with with many other countries around the world that also sort of see him as a kind of national folk hero. And the St. George's cross, long before it was ever associated with England, was the flag of the Republic of Genoa in Italy. And the English used to fly the flag kind of when the English ships used to fly the flag as a sort of protective measure, that they were kind of under the protection of Genoa, which was a big kind of had a massive kind of naval power at the time. And the English actually paid Genoa a tax for using the flag for many, many centuries. And so, here we have two of our kind of most kind of dominant English symbols, neither of them having any particular connection to England. And you compare that with, the Welsh flag, for example, where I write a lot about Wales in the book, that you've got the red dragon, which has this long, long history in the mythology of Wales that kind of feels really, really rooted. Obviously, there are other parts of the world that have dragons, but there is this kind of much deeper rooted sense of connection between the red dragon and the Welsh Welsh landscape and story, and it's just not quite the same in England.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think it's almost like quite interesting. Like, why do you think England hasn't sort of turned these sort of myths and folklore and other things into like part of their identity? Why do you think there's such a massive sort of, because Wales is so good in a way at going, you know, we have this long-standing connection with the dragon, for example, you know, it's on our flag. Why do you think, from like, you know, researching your book, that's the
Yeah,
case?
it's an interesting one because, I write in the book about the fact that I spent a lot of time in Wales growing up and noticed
Why
this
do you think?
really big difference between Welsh expressions of national pride and English expressions of national pride, and the kind of Welshness. I felt really welcomed in by it. I felt like it was kind of alluring and appealing and not non-threatening in any way. The reaction that I have to the Welsh flag very different to the reaction that I have to the St George's Cross, even though that's supposedly my flag. So I was thinking a lot about this, and well, where does that really come from? And I think one aspect of it is that, the Welsh have this incredible body of myths to draw from. The Mabinogion, that these stories are ancient. They've been passed down for a really long time, and they've kind of been a cohesive sort of body of stories for quite a long time. And I don't think that the English have older stories. There's sort of like, Beowulf and these other kind of Anglo-Saxon um, poems and things like that, but there isn't a kind of cohesive body of English myth and story in the same way that the Welsh have. So that's one aspect. And I think that also a kind of a clear definition of Englishness and a kind of clear definition of English symbols hasn't really been the priority for England. The Welsh is a nation that has been sort of oppressed and colonized by the English, right? So Welsh nationhood and its kind of symbols were consciously constructed and sort of really kind of carefully sort of preserved and protected in the face of English oppression and English domination. Whereas, the English haven't had to kind of fend off outsiders in the same way. They haven't been subject to a kind of dominant colonial power telling them that they're not good enough, or that their language is somehow evidence of them being inferior or anything like that. So there hasn't been that need to sort of preserve and protect Englishness in the same way that there has been for Welshness. And also that there was this very specific moment when the Welsh, after the Union of 1707, as I write about in the book, in the
I'm
18th.
about to ask you, yeah, because it seems like there's actually an it's far newer than I realised, right? When they sat down and wrote all of this and decided to all get together in Wales and say, right, this is going to be. Oh, I didn't know that at all. I thought, oh, this is ancient, So when I read that, I was like, oh wow, yeah,
It just shows you how
yeah,
constructed and made up all of our kind of national symbols and
yeah.
stories are. And that's not to say, the Welsh did draw upon older sort of stories that were pre-existing. But as you say, there was this moment where there was a kind of collective and conscious flourishing and conjuring of national symbols, and it was a deliberate kind of act. And so I think that what that shows you is that the kind of national identities are always a little bit fictional, and that we can choose which heroes we want to commemorate and incorporate into our story. We can choose the symbols that we want to put on our flag, or we can have as part of our insignia. We can choose the stories that we want to tell about who we are. And so it kind of gives, I feel like that gives us kind of some creative license and freedom to do the same thing today, to sort of have a rethink about what those stories are that actually reflect who we want to be now, that reflect the history as we see it today, as opposed to a kind of clinging on to a lot of these kind of the British dominant kind of mottos and symbols were tied to a very particular era of British history. They were Rule Britannia, and even the Rule Britannia and the Union flag. They were conjured at the kind of at the sort of the birth of Britain, and that kind of the start of that imperial journey. So I think it's fair to say that we should sort of rethink them in the present day.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a space, like you said, to dream up. And if we could all get together in Wales and dream up, how we wanted it to be and what stories we wanted to tell, and I think there's space. Then you're right to like open that up, and the thing that I found interesting is you touch on intangible cultural heritage and the fact that the UK ratified the convention. And I think that gives us a perfect opportunity to then look at, all of the different sort of intangible culture that we have in across Britain, and really get people involved in what that looks like. Can you sort of delve in a little bit more to that?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, many people will have heard of UNESCO before, this big kind of global body that offers protection for either physical sites or examples of intangible cultural heritage. And yeah, I think this convention was set up probably 20 or 21 years ago, kind of offering nations the opportunity to come up with examples of their intangible cultural heritage. So that being, stories or songs or practices or traditions, rites and rituals, things that are passed down sort of from person to person, rather than aspects of high culture that are kind of things of books or, or kind of material culture like country houses and things like that. That nations could offer up those aspects of culture and get some sort of protection for them. And it's quite interesting thinking about, Britain is one of the last countries to do so. And you think, well, what's that about?
Yeah.
Why is that? And I think that is because in this country, there is a sense in which, our history is in, the great works of Shakespeare, or in, stately homes, or in these kind of slightly more highfalutin aspects of culture, not in Morris dancers plodding down a cobbled street, or the Mary Lloyd, or these other folk traditions that kind of they're a bit more DIY. They're of the people. They're not to do with the academies and the institutions, and they also paint a really different picture of Britain to some of those kind of loftier, grander aspects of our culture. So I think it's a really interesting moment. I'm sort of ask myself, is the government doing it now?
Yeah.
What has shifted? Why is the government, now seeing these aspects of culture that have been for so long sort of been dismissed as sort of silly and
Well,
not worthy of? Yeah.
Yeah, we've pushed a lot on craft being
Mm.
included in the DCMS, which is the Department of Media, Culture and Sports remit, because I feel that focusing just on design is a flawed solution. So craft is definitely a part of it. I've also said within that you can't just look at in fashion designers, you have to look at the totality. And we lobbied on this piece of policy because it seemed logical. And Meg was very hot on it before for a long time, so we did lobby on that. And then I think also you've got Heritage Craft, an association that is led and punches well beyond its weight, and did a brilliant event I wasn't able to go to last night in London for London Craft Week that Harriet from our team attended. So I think there is a resurgence, but I think for me, what has happened is it's about class. So
Absolutely.
a Morris dancer and a willow weaver were historically working class roles, and the tradition, obviously, to be an academician at the Royal Academy, you would not have been working class to have been accepted. So I feel that we had this hierarchy from Victorian times about what was and wasn't culture, and that's perhaps why, as the dominant culture within the four kingdoms of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, that's why we've been the paradigm. I mean, there's a question I want to ask about paganism, but actually thinking about who's listening as well. We've done a lot of work with the SNP, and obviously Plaid have just won Wales. And I just thinking about your relationship with the flag of England, which I have a very similar relationship with too. For me, the nationalists of the other territories like Wales and Ireland, Northern Ireland and Scotland, their nationalism doesn't seem to have been, from my experience of engaging with them, predicated on people being thrown out. It's about establishing a new voice away from Westminster. And I think the flag, for me, St George, I grew up in an NF, a National Front area. And And so the flags, up and down the M1 and up and down the M4, and still actually I drove through Golders Green not last week, and they're still up there, the St George flags. They represented exclusion rather than inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what your thoughts are about what that flag waving has meant, because you touch on it in the book.
Yeah, I think that that's what I kind of wrote about, this idea of the murky relationship that we have with our flags, because I think that there were probably some innocent people who didn't realize that actually this whole campaign had been orchestrated by, far right groups. Not just, when I say far right, I mean, that there was one of the guys behind it, I've forgotten his name, was jailed for for his involvement in a racist attack. Not just, we're not just talking about the kind of people on the right, we're talking about violent racists who attack people based on the color of their skin. The Operation Raise Your Colors was orchestrated by those types of people. And so a lot of the flags that you see going up, I was in North Wales recently, and there was a protest there because it's been proposed that there's going to be a hotel that's going to be used to house refugees, and
that's in my hometown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was talking to one of the ladies who was hosting the event that I was talking, and she was like, a lot of the people were there like waving English flags, and they weren't locals. A lot of them weren't locals. These are people who are kind of inciting this hatred, and they'll travel all around the country it's not even their local areas, and they'll be putting up flags that it's not necessarily a local thing. But anyway, caught up in this tide. You even had the Prime Minister, saying, talking about how much he loves to wave his flag, and probably innocent people thought, oh, well, we'll put up the St George's Cross as a kind of celebration of Englishness, but it's not realizing that there's all these other dark forces sort of in the mix. And I think that it is a problem for English people, right? It is a problem for English people that what the far right have done, what groups like NF have done, and the BNP before them, and the English Defence League, is that they've made it really hard for well-meaning English people to celebrate their Englishness without somehow being drawn into all of that. Or been made to feel like they're doing something bad, which then stokes further division. So what I'm trying to say in this book is, and often what happens is English people who reject those toxic exclusionary visions of Englishness, they just go, oh, I don't want anything to do with it. Or they just sort of renege on, or just sort of reject their Englishness altogether, And the problem is that when people do that, then there are no English people actually contributing to a kind of more progressive vision of what English pride, or like a kind of progressive vision of Englishness could look like. And you're leaving it and you're handing it over to the people with toxic and exclusionary views, what that is, to define it. And everyone else just goes, oh, I don't want to be part of that. And then you've probably got some people who are English and proud to be English, not necessarily far right, but then who feel like they're being attacked and penalized for just expressing who they are, which is kind of fair enough. So it's very complex. It's very complicated. And that's why I think that, like, those of us who have roots in England, those of us who are connected to England in some way, we have a responsibility, which is to contribute to this alternative conversation. And as we've spoken about, this conjuring of alternative English stories. And this is where, for me, finding out all these stories about English radicals, was really inspiring for me. All the people who've protested against the kind of imperialist, dominant English system that oppressed loads of white working class people in this country for generations, as well as people across the empire and in Wales and Scotland and Ireland, obviously. So I feel like this to me was one really rich seam. I think that we could look to more for inspiring visions of Englishness. Think of William Morris, think of William Blake, think of the Diggers, think of the Luddites, think about all the people throughout the centuries who were completely fucked over by the system and who fought back. And like that to me is a source of English pride that's got nothing to do with dominating and colonizing other nations. In fact, it's about recognizing that we've all been, people have been historically being kind of oppressed by the same system. So
I think there's always been a radical underbelly to the British anyway, because in fashion, you see it where we're very good at disrupting the uniform because most of us have had to wear a uniform at school, and then we work out ways to express ourselves. And I think that's been the root of many a good designer actually in fashion. And you note in the book the rise of paganism, and that it's one of the fastest growing faiths in the UK, which I think is interesting because that's certainly never covered in the press. I can't imagine. I can't quite imagine what the Mail would make of
I was
that.
going to say the Daily Mail would have
To their fear of Islam. I mean, God forbid, pagans and kebabs. Can you imagine the front lines? And I just wonder. You're clearly a different generation to me. I mean, for me, that thread of Britishness has always been very resonant. Because I was part of in the 90s. I was a part of that world for a long time, and I'm still very connected to a lot of those people, whether that was from squats in London or from the convoy and from then traveling. So for me, it isn't such a shock that there's been a rise because it's always been part of the counterculture that I've known people. I don't always agree with them. But I just wonder, from your perspective, looking backwards and looking forwards, where you think that rise is coming from for your demographic, because obviously you're a different age group to me.
Well, as you say, it's always been there. That's one of the sort of reasons I wrote this book, and one of the things that drew me to writing this book, like just being drawn in by that mystical Britishness that's so opposite to the jingoistic Rule Britannia, post-colonial melancholia, that kind of whole vision of Britain that is the dominant export, but there is, of course, there's all these ancient myths and legends. There's King Arthur, and even just going to the ruined castles and ley lines, and these kind of esoteric aspects of British culture, tales of the pagans and the druids, that like really drew me in, and just like well, what is this about, and how can this sort of sit alongside the kind of stiff upper lip and keep calm, carry on? They feel like so opposite. So I think lots of people sense that and feel that aspect of the land and of this sort of alternative culture, and are drawn in by it. And thinking about my generation, I grew up, I watched The Wicker Man. It wasn't of my generation, but I there are these aspects of culture where we find the evidence of this other Britain, or even hearing about the raves at Stonehenge, and that whole thing. It's like, what is that about? And so I think there's this curiosity about this alternative, sort of esoteric, as you say, countercultural aspect of Britain. I think it also coalesces with a few other sort of trends that are happening in this country, and I guess across the West at the moment, like with kind of Christianity and mainstream religion on the decline. There's still a desire for mystery and spirituality and kind of other ways of making sense of why we're here, and there's a desire for the sacred and for ritual and enchantment and all those things. And so I think like that's one of the reasons that people are turning to paganism, and it connects to people becoming more interested in meditation and astrology and these sorts of alternative knowledge systems that have kind of been dismissed and sort of seen as woo-woo for a long time. I think people are starting to look to those, and also looking for aspects of those of that world that are homegrown. Now we understand that, like, yes, we can go and visit ashrams, and we can go and learn from other cultures, and we can look to the East for their kind of spiritual traditions. And not to say that that's a problem, but I think people are more aware of the issues of cultural appropriation. So they're like, well, what do we have here? What are the spiritual legacies here?
I used to call it the squatters' Raj when I was in India. I was like, they think they're Mick Jagger getting into a rickshaw. It's really offensive.
Yeah.
And I was very offended at the time I didn't necessarily always have the language, but I was so like, this is spiritual voyeurism, and they need to connect with their culture. But I think it came probably from a place of feeling that absence.
Yeah.
And not seeing that it's always been there under the surface. I mean, where I grew up was definitely not the most beautiful physical landscape. It was a council estate, and I grew up in the shops above we had a shop, a business, and we had one of the flats. But I saw a magic in the sunsets, and you could always. I think it's always been there, those connections. Meg, I think it would be really good if you could, because you've woven in some questions about the right to roam, and that's been really pertinent because I noticed that the Daily Mail, which I read every day because I always want to know what they're covering, and they're covering that the Princess of Wales' sisters denied the right to roam for her Cotswolds manor house.
Oh, really?
And they're up in arms about it.
The Daily Mail are?
The Daily Mail are.
Interesting.
Yeah, which I think it's interesting because it's just hitting two stories with one stone, which is obviously a tabloid win. But I wonder, Meg, if you want to just draw that in, because there's so much of the land since enclosure and onwards that we're not able to actually roam.
Yeah.
I think it ties in quite nicely, doesn't it? Because I think what I got from the sense of what you were talking about in terms of paganism was the fact that we don't have the sense of community as much as we once did. And I think that there is a barrier to access nature as well. And then obviously within that, you've got identity and community and loss of place, sense of self, that's all tied into that. And I thought you actually wrote like a gorgeous paragraph. I'm going to quote it. Crucially for my quest, it raises questions we still ask ourselves today about who the land belongs to, who has access to it, and how our sense of identity relates to the ground beneath our feet. And I think that was really pertinent to like everything that we've just talked about. It all ties together, doesn't it? And I suppose my question is, in terms of the right to roam in sort of England and Wales, do you obviously agree that we should go the same way that Scotland has, because it would sort of reconnect us with the land and therefore as well with sort of local storytelling, community and sense of place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's an amazing documentary that's about to come out. I think it's just a few screenings of it and stuff at the moment. It's called Our Land, and
I've seen
you've seen clips from it, and they're sort of following the right to roam movement, but they're also in conversation with the landowners, some more progressive ones, who've inherited this land from their ancestors, and others who are less progressive, and it's an interesting sort of representation of this sort of debate. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I spoke to Nadia Sheikh, who's one of the people behind the contemporary right to roam movement, and she was talking about this relationship between enclosure, so the privatization of vast swathes of the English and Welsh countryside over the last over several centuries, and the way that displaced communities and destroyed dialects and stories and traditions that had sort of been sort of binding communities with land and culture for generations. And that when you sort of erode that local sense of identity, that local sense of pride, the kind of nationalism and the great sort of lofty ideas of Englishness sort of come in as a kind of stop in, as a kind of alternative to that. And so your sense of pride is about these kind of great big military endeavors and these kind of something that feels quite abstract in a way that, like, whether it's I know I feel really proud to be connected to London, and that's because it's the place that I've spent a lot of time in, and it's the place that I know intimately. And it's not because my ancestors were born here, but it's because of the places that I've spent time in, and I know the people around me in my local my parks, and so therefore I'm invested in caring for it and caring for people around me. Or in Wales, where I spent a lot of time as a kid, like I wasn't born there, but I had that sense of community there, and that's a kind of tangible sense of identity and pride that makes sense because it's rooted in experience. Whereas as soon as you start talking about like British pride, or something like that, you can only really talk about it in terms of these big historical events, and because those are the only things that actually tie us together as millions of people that we are, each with coming from different places and different backgrounds. So I think that there is this connection between how people have been severed from the land and from that kind of that more local sense of identity and nationalisms and that sense of loss of culture that you were talking about. Why people go to retreats in do ayahuasca in the Amazon or whatever, searching for this spiritual sense of belonging or whatever, because people don't find it beneath their feet. And I think that this is where folk traditions new ones as well as old ones can be really useful, because ultimately what folk traditions are, it's just people coming together and saying, we want to put on an event for our local community. Let's get the local I don't know, like I spoke to quite a few people who'd started new traditions, and it was fusing like older customs with new ones, and just making stuff up, and just giving people a reason to come together and use their creative faculties. And you don't have to be a great singer or a great artist to be involved. Everyone gets stuck in making funny costumes out of tinfoil or whatever. And what they're really about is this community cohesion, and like a reason to feel proud of where you're from, a reason to come together. And I think this is where, this is to me the power of these folk traditions. And I think that I've got this dream that, what would it look like if every little district or region or village or town or whatever was given a little pot of money to put on an event for their community that could combine the traditions of newer incomers and people who've been there for a long time, and force people to actually communicate with each other and work together on something big, greater than them. I think that this is the great kind of cohesive radical power of community kind of gatherings like this. And I think that they could be, I think not everyone loves the idea of folk, but if we remove that word from it and just say like community gatherings, I think that this is one of the antidotes, I think, to this sort of severe sense of isolation and that a lot of people are feeling in this country at the moment.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think there's also a definite piece in there about integrating creativity, storytelling back into communities as well. I think we're quite hot on that, aren't we, Tamara?
We are. We developed a framework called it's a lot of words, but it's creative wellbeing economy. And we did that before the last general election a while back, didn't we? Basically in 21, we were doing a report looking at sustainability. I mean, it was a report for a parliamentary report. And I was like, this is all very like awful. Everything we looked at was, we're running out of finite resources. We're exploiting, this is in terms of fashion. We are exploiting people. We're exploiting the earth. I'm sorry, I'm solutions orientated. Wait, what are we going to do? And the economist that we were working with said, well, there aren't many solutions. Because creative well-being was a bit of a new phrase there. I said, well, we're going to have to create a framework, because you start so if in economic terms you'd be looking at GVA, not GDP, you'd be looking at the value add, which is what you're talking about with, if you go to like a fair, or if you go to like a jumble sale, or if you go to like the, I ran the campaign to save our library. If you have an event there, you're bringing people together. What I loved about the library was I was seeing a multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multi-class gathering place that was free, where you weren't charging for classes, that was open to all.
Hot drink
and bringing everybody together. And I think that is what you're talking about there with that sense of community. So that framework underlines all our work. And although we are called Fashion Roundtable and we work within fashion, increasingly we're, because I'm solutions orientated, we have to look at, new narratives, which is what I think you do really successfully in the book, Zakia, is you bring out an alternative to the made in China, St. George plastic flags that just were so disturbing on so many levels. And I just, before we draw to an end, because I could talk to you for hours, and I it wouldn't be fair on you, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. How do people who want to connect with that sense of Britishness that isn't a populist narrative, but is a heart, because I'm feeling it's from your heart, it's from a connection to something it's not always verbal, it's an intangible, it's a magic actually. What would you suggest? Where do they look? Other than buying your book, obviously, which is a fantastic start, and I'll hold it up with my very fuzzy, slightly Vaseline.
We'll put all the links in.
Yeah, we'll obviously put the links in, and we already have shared the book. Other than buying your book, listening to your podcasts and your TV programs on BBC, where else would you like people to, or suggest that people could look?
Well, I would say, just try and do a bit of research and find out if there's a tradition near you, or that you could go and get involved in, or just witness, because there are so many all around the country. They're led often just by volunteers. That's just like you have to go on some weird Facebook page to find out to kind of find out the details. But there is a magic of, and it's often getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to watch the sunrise somewhere, and you're sort of on the way that, what am I doing? Why am I bothering? When I'm knackered, I should have stayed in bed. And then like as I did, to get up to Glastonbury tour for the spring equinox, and then Stonehenge again for the spring equinox in the last chapter of the book. There's just something when you arrive and you're there, and there are all these other people there who've had the same mad idea as you, to just go and partake in something that flies in the face of all kind of consumer capitalist sort of ideas about productivity and how we should spend our time. No, I'm going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to go and hold hands with loads of strangers and watch a druid do a strange ritual, and it's going to be magical and fun and silly. And even if you sneer at it, it's important that I feel like you'll get something from it. You'll get something from it. So find out if there are any traditions near you. I can also recommend, there's a really beautiful there's a writer called Glennie Kindred who I really like, and she does these beautiful hand-drawn sort of books, and they're all about the Wheel of the Year. So they're all about relating to that. So most of us grow up with the calendar of like Christmas, Easter, summer holidays, etc., Halloween, these kind of big commercial holidays. And I've really, really enjoyed, I'm just thinking if I've got the book up here, I don't think I have, trying to tune back into that seasonal calendar, the Wheel of the Year, the equinoxes, the solstices, their midpoints in between, and she writes really beautifully about the kind of the kind of sanctity and the symbolism of each of those moments. So the spring equinox is it's like, the winter's over. Set your intentions for the year ahead. It's all about kind of hope and looking ahead, and that's very different to Samhain, which is the kind of Celtic festival on which Halloween is based, which is all about the dark and preparing yourself to enter into the darkness and the shadows, and what comes up when we dwell in the shadows, and that need to acknowledge the dark parts of the year and of our kind of our culture and our being. But yeah, so I'd recommend checking out Glennie Kindred's Wheel of the Year books, and trying to just sort of tune in a bit to that seasonal calendar in some way, because I found it's really added a lot, especially living in a city. Just making a little effort to mark those shifts has made me feel a lot more connected to the world around me.
Yeah, I think it's a sense that it's always just under the surface. Yeah, I mean, I was at the hairdresser's and the guy next to me was telling me about his medieval fair that they were doing. And that I needed to come, and I started talking to him about the dissolution of the monasteries, because I'm a massive Tudor history geek, and Anne Boleyn's place and all of that, which actually the consequence of that marriage was enclosure, which we spoke about earlier, that wasn't her intention, that was probably Cromwell's. But I think what's encouraging, and what I found soul food from Zakia, was a sense of there is more to this than meets the eye, and we are being so met with one version, and yet we know, when we just have to look around, that we are a polymath, polyglot, diverse, and always ever have been. We're an island. I love the idea of we were a sanctuary, and perhaps if we drew on that language, we could counter that narrative. And I that's why I think your book is a polemic for showing a different way, because we have been, well, certainly with the election last week, I felt very scared. And I was saying to my husband, I used to feel like this as a child. The National Front used to march in my area, and they used to put flyers up. And I remember reading when I was about 7, and I really distinctly remember they said they were going to repatriate foreigners. And I was like, but where do I go?
Yeah.
My mum's from Enfield. Where do I go? And I remember that feeling of, where do I go? And you can mask it, but I think what your book draws on is, no, this is our land. And there's a beauty in that. And I also love the idea of all these new myths that you're drawing on, that, like the festivals that are newer and, are that folk, that a love and a quest doesn't have to be aspic, that it's actually always evolving, because it was ever thus.
I mean, you threw yourself into it. I mean, you even took part in a new one, didn't you?
Yeah. Down in Cornwall, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an act of bravery if you're used to being on the side. Dressing up as a wolf.
It was good fun though. It was good fun.
And we have a lot of druids actually coming up the Orme, where I live, in Wales, and it's quite big here. So maybe I should go and check it out sometime.
I think your time as a wolf is upon me, Meg.
I'm sure there'll be a Facebook page somewhere.
I'm sure. Yeah. So look on Facebook, buy your book. We'll share all the links, and we'll also share the link for the book that you've recommended. I can't thank you enough, Zakia, for coming on. Meg, is there anything you'd like to add before we?
No, I just thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Loved your book.
Yeah, thank you so much. It means a lot.
About it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Thank you. And I wish you every success. I know you've been longlisted and for the Women's Prize, and I wish you every success with that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Bye.